We are the higher self of the One, known to this instrument in the language sequence terms as Timothy Neel Burns, who incarnated on this current space-time continuum on 1952, and we are now communicating through this instrument who has offered itself to be of service to the One Infinite Creator by acting as a channel of communication for providing information to the entities who desire. We, as the higher self of this entity known as Timothy Neil Burns, are now communicating from our density in the sixth density consciousness, the density of consciousness wherein there is no separation but only unity can be felt from our level of experience. As we have already transcended above the third, fourth, and the fifth density consciousness, we are able to recognize that there is but one creator experiencing the cycles of incarnation and learning the lessons of recognizing the internal value of the self. As each entity begins to progress further and further throughout the incarnation cycle, there is but many lessons which can be learned, and the lessons include those of understanding the internal nature of the recognition of the self and also understanding the value of the self as each entity progresses further and further throughout the conscious reality. This follows and provides a deeper understanding of the internal aspect of the self, which leads to a experience of the understanding of the inner nature, for each entity has the opportunity of transitioning higher and higher in consciousness as each entity begins to progress further in the levels of understanding of consciousness. This entity wants to understand many queries pertaining to this current incarnation cycle. However, before we begin, we shall lay the foundation by stating that this entity, known as Timothy Neil Burns, is experiencing this incarnation and has the free will to exercise the choice of the type of thought forms and the feelings it wants to entertain in the illusion complex, which will lead this entity into further progression into a higher vibration state of understanding. This furthermore allows each entity, and including this entity, to navigate further and further throughout its cycle of transition as it begins to understand the internal nature of the working of the self. For this incarnation cycle is meant for teaching this entity the lessons of interaction with other entities. Thereby, it must recognize that it has free will, and also it must recognize that it is not only incarnated in this current timeline, but has multiple timelines, and each timeline leads to a different subset of interaction or experience, as each experience allows a different type of lessons to be learned depending on the situation and the vibrations presented by this entity. For vibration is the most important aspect which must be learned by each entity, as each entity's vibration needs to match the higher sub-octaves of reality, for the vibration of the self must be in check every moment as the vibration interacts with the outside world, creating a native vibration and also giving rise to the understanding of the nature of unity. Furthermore, this entity wants to understand why did it choose this incarnation. In this regard, we are of the opinion that this entity chose this incarnation because of a suitable catalyst available in this incarnation, specifically the catalyst of the environment as well as the catalyst of the egoic mind, since in the current lifetime of the planetary sphere there is also an opportunity for graduation. This entity chose this incarnation since it became ready to graduate into the vibrations of the fourth density of the heart center. As it chose this energy center vibration, it has the ability of navigating throughout the full potential of understanding the internal nature of the self, thereby realizing that there is but one creator, and also the opportunity to enter into the vibration of love and compassion. This entity wants to understand what is the most important thing it needs to do about its life right now and the lessons from this situation. In this regard, we are of the opinion that the lesson it can learn in this cycle of catalyst being presented is the lesson of forgiveness and the lesson of transitioning or ascending from a lower state of consciousness with the working of the egoic self to a higher state of consciousness, with the working from the heart energy center, as the heart energy center leads to the opening of the gateway to the flux of energies from the fourth density, which allows the collapse of energy vibrations of the love light from the fourth density to create a vibrational match inside the bodily complex of this entity, leading to a transition into the higher vibrations of the self. This entity also wants to understand its purpose. In this incarnation, we are of the opinion that the purpose for this entity is to recognize its own true nature by interacting with the catalyst presented on the outside. Specifically, this entity needs to recognize its true inner nature by understanding that it is, in essence, experiencing each incarnation cycle and learning many of the lessons in order to transition further and further throughout the gateway of incarnation cycle. This will allow this entity to navigate and understand the internal working of the self. We shall now share with you one space-time continuum information of the soul evolutionary cycle of this entity known as Timothy. However, remember to exercise the discernment as there are multiple timelines possible for this entity's incarnation to operate in. This entity in the first density experience started its life cycle on the planet known as Alcyon in the Pleiadian star system around 4.6 million years ago. In that level of existence, it began to learn many of the lessons of interaction with other entities in the first density level of consciousness as it began to operate and recognize the value of its own inner nature. This entity on that level of consciousness also further began to learn many of the lessons of understanding of the self, furthering the recognition of the internal nature of its own reality. This allowed this entity to then understand the value that it has in this incarnation, which is the value of love light energies as it influences the flux of consciousness. In that level of consciousness, in the first density, it started to understand the lessons of beingness in the form of a water element and cycle through in other elemental forms such as fire element, etc. After creating the basic baseline of beingness on that level, it was given the soul name of Timar. This allowed this entity to then further propagate and learn the lessons of the later vibrations of the first density reality in the form of a stone element, thereby understanding to learn the lessons of the second density consciousness. In the beginning stages of the second density consciousness, this entity then started to learn the lessons in the form of a plant life, similar to the plant life as can be spotted upon the Earth planet. However, this experience occurred on the Pleiadian star system, which gave this entity the opportunity of merging the beingness and the awareness aspect, and later on led this entity to incarnate as a animal life form in the later vibrations of second density, which allowed it the further propagation of understanding of beingness and awareness. This led this entity to then recognize the internal value of the self. As it began to progress further and further in consciousness, this entity then started to recognize the lessons of reality and also started to understand the internal working of the self. Later on, this entity, after learning many of the lessons on this level of consciousness, graduated into the beginning stages of the third density reality. In the level of third density consciousness, it began to learn the lessons of choosing the path of polarity based upon the choices it made in this incarnation. This entity faced a large amount of catalyst, specifically the catalyst of the environment, which triggered the red ray energy center of this entity in the beginning incarnation cycles. As it began to progress after incarnation, this entity's first density incarnation cycle led it to understand the lessons of the third density reality. However, it became influenced by some negative entities in the third density, and it was diverging its vibrations towards the service to self attitude. However, later on, this entity then began to progress further and further in the recognition of the self. After this entity then began to transition into the later vibrations of third density by choosing the path of positive polarity upon meeting with an ascended master, which guided it to see the reality as a choice, in a similar manner as the lessons which were imparted to this entity via many other so called channels of the Law of One. This entity in that incarnation also met with an ascended master of the Law of One who taught this entity the lessons of choosing the positive pathway. This led this entity to further enter into a vibration of positive type, and this entity reached into the later vibrations of this reality. In the vibrations of the later third density consciousness, after reaching this level, it was then transported to the space-time continuum of the lands known as Agartha to your people. In the lands of Agartha, this entity incarnated, wherein this entity started to understand the lessons of incarnation cycles as it began to progress throughout the cycles of transition further and further, leading it to understand the internal nature and the variable nature of consciousness and reality as it began to progress further in the understanding of the self. Upon reaching into the later vibrations of this reality, it was then able to accelerate the understanding of love light, of the choice it has to make in the incarnation cycle, specifically the choice of choosing the path of polarity, which led this entity to then further polarize itself towards the incarnation cycle of the later suboctave of the conscious reality. And after learning many of the lessons on this level of consciousness, it began to understand that it has to make a choice of being of service to others or service to self. In the lands of Agartha, it chose the pathway of the light and decided to be of service to others. This followed and allowed this entity to incarnate on the Earth planet. In the first incarnation, it began incarnating on the Earth planet on 1837. In that incarnation cycle, it was known by the name of Umara. In the lands known as Sri Lanka as by your people currently, this entity started to learn many of the lessons in that level. However, in that incarnation cycle, it was unable to fully learn to balance its energy centers, because of which this entity could not directly enter into the vibrations of graduation. This entity in that incarnation crossed over after suffering from physical imbalances leading to disease on the space-time illusion complex of 1901, after which it reincarnated in the next incarnation on 1915 and was known by the name of Namina. This entity in that incarnation acted as a nurse, which allowed it to polarize more towards the positive service to others aspect, and also learned to balance its energy centers in that incarnation, leading it to then reincarnate on this current timeline, on the space-time illusion complex of 1952. And now this entity has a wonderful opportunity before its own self, and this opportunity is the vibration alignment of its heart center in order to graduate into the fourth density vibration. Hence we leave you in love light of the one creator. Go forth and rejoice in the power and in the peace. Bye.